Now, when I tell people that I've danced in 9 different states, everybody wants to know, "Oh, have you tried Vegas? Las Vegas, Nevada? I bet that's the best place to be a stripper, right?" No. At least not in my experience. Other girls might say different. But here's the thing you need to keep in mind with Las Vegas. So I don't know how many different strip clubs there are, maybe 16 or something. And some of the bigger ones, they're mega sized clubs that are the size of football fields. They have hundreds of girls working there a night, and their house fees are some of the highest, right? I want to say day shift was like $50 and then it goes all the way up to 140. Now, mind you, 140 is the off stage fee, so you don't have to pay that high of a fee. You could always just show up day shift and work for 12 hours straight and pay the lower fees, but it's pretty hard on your body. So I figured out pretty quick that it wasn't worth showing up early, that you're actually better off showing up late, paying a little more instead of working the shitty part of the shift for I don't know how many hours and then getting discouraged by the time that money actually walks in the door. In my experience, don't get me wrong, I made okay money working in Vegas. And I went out there one year during convention season. I looked at the convention calendar and I saw what all the biggest conventions were, and I went out there for every major convention. And at the time, I had a boyfriend that had a second place in Vegas, and so I didn't have to pay for lodging out of pocket. And that was extremely helpful because I would see some of these girls that were paying for everything out of pocket, the high house fees, the high accommodation fees, and they would literally just sit there and wait by the door and pounce on the first guy that came in. The level of competition in Vegas was like nowhere else I've ever seen. Also, there's probably more pimps in Vegas than anywhere else that I've ever been. And so that's why a lot of these girls were just so cutthroat. And given that I don't have that mentality, like I honestly, maybe I'm just not the hardest worker, but a lot of times I'm like, you know what, it's just too hard. The money isn't coming super easily today. I'm out. There are shifts where there's not that many girls, there's all these customers, and so it just feels so much easier to make money because everybody's going to you. You're not over here trying to fight girls who can get to the customer first. Another thing about Vegas is they call it kickback city for a reason, right? It's because every time you make money, you're kicking back like 6 different people a tip, right? There's like the floor guys, the DJ, the house mom, the valet. And in some of these clubs, you have to valet your car. Like it wasn't an option. You either Uber there, or if you're driving, you have to valet. And then some of the floor guys, they're like, okay, I'll walk you over to the guys with money, but you have to break me off 20%. And I remember I didn't know this, right? One of the floor guys helped me out and I tipped him out 10%, which was like $50. And he was like, no, I'm not going to walk you over the guys again if you're only tipping out 10%. I was like, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Here you go. Here's 20. But yeah, so you have to keep that in mind too. So when a lot of these girls talk about, oh, I made so much money in Vegas, here's another thing. I really didn't realize this, but a lot of girls will tell you their numbers pre-tip out. But tip outs are really, it's almost like a fee. You know what I mean? It's not really like a tip. It's almost like mandatory. A lot of the girls are like, oh, I made this much, but then they forget to deduct their house fee and their tip out. And so the number that they're telling you is actually pretty inaccurate. And I personally never did that. I would always say, okay, what am I going home with at the end of the night? And that's the number that I would report to people. And maybe that's why my numbers don't seem like as overinflated as some other people's. But that being said, my overall experience working in Vegas was I didn't really go back for a second season because I realized that I was making the same amount of money working in LA and I was only working 7-hour shifts. In Vegas, because at the time a lot of the clubs were open 24 hours, this was pre COVID. I don't know if it's still like that. I believe it still is. I found that I worked a way longer shift in Vegas. Like you were there for 10 hours, 12 hours. And if you stuck it out, it could pay off. I do know girls that are like, oh, I would go home with thousands, but I was literally there until 10 a.m. the next day. And I personally don't really drink at work. Like I might have a beer or two, but because I don't drink hard liquor, I just could not really stick it out for that long. And for that reason, I didn't like Vegas. I don't recommend it. I definitely don't think it's the best place in the country to be a stripper. Not at all. That's probably one of the biggest lies. If anything, some of the best places are like the little towns, little oil towns, right? Where competition is so low. There's 10 girls at the clubs. And so you come in and it's just so easy for you to make money and you're walking out with thousands in like a 6-hour shift. So that's a pro tip for you guys right there. Portland, Oregon. Okay, so I've actually danced in 2 cities in Oregon, Salem and Portland. Money wise, honestly, I did about the same in both cities. I danced at Rouge in Portland, and I danced at Stars in Salem and Presley's Playhouse. The cool thing about Portland though is because it has the most strip clubs per capita, I want to say it's like you're gonna be able to get hired somewhere. Even if the first club doesn't hire you, go down the street and another club will hire you. And I managed to find a motel in Portland that was 400 bucks a week, and it was like in prime location, right? So it was like 2 blocks away from the club, great food nearby. Like I had a pretty fun time being in Portland. Even though the money wasn't great, I would not go back there for work purposes. Like I enjoyed living in that downtown area. It was summertime, which summer in Portland is still overcast, but okay, so let's talk about Alaska. I worked at ABC Alaskan Bush Co. in Anchorage. The application process, I applied online, I submitted some photos, and they're like, okay, you're hired. What dates do you want to come? So, Anchorage, unlike most other places that I've worked, you're actually an employee and you do have to be there for 3 weeks minimum to get hired. You have to commit to that because you are getting a check. As an employee, they want you to pay a really high house fee. I want to say it's $190, but then you get like 180 of it back in paycheck form, which I know it sounds weird, but I think it was just some kind of like legal loophole when they went from being independent contractors to being employees. That was just how the attorneys worded it so that they could get around the law. I don't know. But since you are an employee over there, I do want to say those girls all got paid out really well when COVID happened. You do get 2 weeks a year off, but they're really strict about scheduling, and for me that was off-putting. Like the 3 weeks that I worked in Alaska, I was actually working 40-hour weeks, which as a dancer that's a lot. I normally only work like 20-hour weeks, right? So you're working 40-hour weeks. There was no pole on the stage. Sometimes the girls that were like feature dancers, they would attach the pole, but I'm not sure if it was a liability thing. There's actually one stage, no pole, just dance around the stage. That actually worked very well for me since I'm not a pole girl kind of gal. Another thing about Alaska though is there was no VIP. So you're only doing $25 dances. I still ended up doing financially better, slightly better than Arizona, but not good enough to where I'd be like, yeah, Alaska. Alaska's where it's at. I knew several dancers that would go out to Alaska to work. And given how slow business gets in Arizona in the summer, not a bad option, go out there. My first week in Alaska, I stayed at a hostel in a private room though, but it was not the most convenient location. And so having to Uber to the club and whatnot. And then I lucked out and found a room for rent for the remainder of my stay. So that helped a lot. So that's another thing you have to take into consideration when you're travel dancing is how much is accommodation going to cost me? How much is transportation going to cost me? Are you driving your own car there? Now, when it came to other states that I've danced in, I just took my own car out there. And I had a very fuel efficient car at the time. I had my little Ford Fiesta. Rest in peace. I now drive a much less fuel efficient car. And economically, it wouldn't really make as much sense for me to drive to different states. But luckily, I've found my footing in Arizona. It's been working out pretty well for me. So that's where I'm at currently.